Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Levenfish Attack. My goal is to have the most in-depth analysis that exists of the Levenfish Attack. It is my favorite way to attack the dragon variation in the Sicilian defense. So any player out there that starts out with e4, you're probably going to get met with the Sicilian defense, and that is c5. And if you get met against the Sicilian defense, you need to have a strong repertoire of how you're going to attack that. There's so many dangerous lines that black can play here. Knight to f3. Then you see the dragon defense, which is d6, d4, pawns exchange in the center of the board after knight takes on d4. Knight to f6, knight c3, and then pawn g6, preparing to bring the bishop here to g7 and attack this long dark square diagonal that white has on the queen side of the board. So this is the dragon variation. If you're not familiar with it, you definitely should make sure that you do some preparation for this. Have a separate video on the Sicilian defense dragon variation. But the Levenfish Attack looks at this position and says, we need to be pretty aggressive, and we want to stop the threat immediately of g7. And what's the best way to do that? Levenfish Attack is f4, and I'll show you in just a minute when we look at the variations of why f4 is so good against the the bishop to g7 square. The three lines that we are going to look at today, one is that bishop to g7. The second one is knight to c6, which is becoming more and more popular. And the last one is knight to d7. Now, there are some other weird variations. You could see pawn down to e5. You could see queen to maybe c7. Those just, I don't see those very often. This is the main line that I play against the dragon variation, and I have quite a few lines that I do want to cover in those three. So that's what we're going to be covering today in the Levenfish Attack. The first variation that we will look at is bishop to g7. This is the main idea that black has when they play the dragon variation. So many players, with their preparation, they don't really think too much about where white's going to go. They're always going to be playing bishop to g7. I'm saying it's a terrible move. I don't recommend it if you are playing the dragon variation and you run against white playing the Levenfish Attack, simply because e5 is just so difficult to deal with. Now, the correct way to respond to this is knight to h5. Doesn't look like a great move, and it's not really fantastic, but we'll look here in a minute of why if you try to do something, pawn takes here on e5, that's just not going to be as strong of a move. So knight to h5, and then we have the bishop to b5 here, checking the king. Now, you don't want to block it with your knight here. Knight to c6 we can see is a clear mistake. Knight takes, pawn takes, and then the bishop's going to fork. This is check, and it's going to take this rook here on a8. Same as if the knight wants to come here to d7. First off, this is blocking this bishop here on c8 from getting involved. But now pawn to e6 is very, very difficult to deal with. You can see it's already attacking this knight. The knight can't move. So really the only way to stop that is the pawn taking here. Anytime you fianchetto to one side of the board, meaning you bring your bishop here to g7 for black, you definitely don't want to give up your f-pawn. This is a very weakened king side of the board. Now all of a sudden white can play knight takes here on e6. This is attacking both the bishop here on a g7 as well as the queen. Maybe the bishop takes down here on c3, check. Really the only in-between move that they have. Pawn takes here on c3, maybe queen to a5. Got to get out of the way from the attack here. But then white just has queen to d4, protecting both the pawn right here and attacking this rook here on h8. You can tell of this king in the center of the board. White can castle on the king side of the board, still has a pretty safe king. Black, on the other hand, his king is in the center of the board. White's going to be able to chase that all over town. So that's not going to be the way to defend it as well. If we do get into this setup, really the only way that black has to respond this correctly is going to be bishop here to d7. There's a few ways that you can attack this. I've seen some people recommend just playing e6. For my own experience playing against this, it doesn't really matter if bishop takes here on b5 or even pawn takes here on e6. I don't think either of those are as strong as just playing queen to e2. This does defend this bishop here on b5. This defends the center of the board here. It still is attacking over here on the queen side, or the the king side of the board. Also, if you want to start pushing with g4 at some point, it supports that as well. So queen to e2 is my recommendation in this board. And so there's a few variations from here that I'm going to look at, just because this is the main line that I tend to see the most when I am met with g7, because we already looked at the knights aren't going to be moving to c6 or d7, so they're almost always going to be playing bishop here to d7. I'm always going to be responding here with queen to e2. Now from here, there's a few moves you could see from black. a6 is pretty common in the Sicilian defense specifically. One, this is going to bring the bishop back. White's going to come back here to c4, but it also stops the white knights from advancing. You always want to be stopping your opponent's knights from advancing up the board. With bishops, they can control so much and get so many places very quickly. You can't stop them as easily as you can with the knights. The knights have very few squares they can go to, especially as they're marching up the board and there's pawns. You can see that the b5 square, especially for white, is a very critical square. So a6, very common in the Sicilian defense. In this case, bishop back here to c4. And then you could see a few options from here, maybe e6. In that case, just castle on the king side. Pretty good setup for white here. If they don't play e6, you could see maybe queen to b6, attacking the knight. I'm going to bring the knight back here to f3. Solid setup. This is very similar to the King's Gambit. If you were to castle on the king side, you have your pawn up here on f4. In this case, it hasn't been taken. Knight to f3. You have center control, but it does maintain pressure on this e5 square. If you try something else, maybe knight to b3, you can still eventually get that material back, but right away you are going to lose some material, whether you take the pawn here or you force the queen back and then you take and they recapture here. You're going to be down a pawn. You're going to be fighting back. I just don't think that you have to play that. Instead, if they're attacking your knight, just bring the knight back here to f3. Still a great square. Protecting this, you have both your pawn, your knight, and your queen still defending this square here on e5. Very, very critical square, e5. This is also blocking off this bishop coming down here and attacking right away on the c3 square. So that's if they play queen to b6. Another option is if they just decide to take it in the center of the board. That's fine. Recapture right here. White's in a good setup. You can start to castle on the king side. So a lot of different options here. You always have surprise attacks depending on where you're at. Maybe you castle on the king side. You can play bishop takes on f7 if they're not prepared for it. It's going to be defended by the rook here on f1. So a lot of attacking lines that white has. Now if we come back and say doesn't have to play a6, another option could just be take here on e5. That's great. I would go ahead and take right here. Maybe they play queen to c7, attacking this pawn. Same thing as before. I'm bringing the knight back here to f3. You don't always have to be attacking, although I am looking for attacking lines generally when I'm playing chess. But sometimes it's better to just bring your pieces back, build up a strong attack, and then push forward depending on where your opponent goes. Knight to f3 makes a lot of sense right here. You can always get your dark square bishop involved into the game, castle on the queen side of the board, but I'm going to be castling on the king side in this setup here. Another option, if they don't take in the center of the board right away, is they could just take the bishop right here. From here, I'm going to go ahead and take with my queen. You can't take with your knight, but this immediately puts your opponent into check. Kind of puts them to the test right away. Knight to d7, pretty common. In this case, same thing as before, knight to f3. While this knight is being pinned down to the king right here, eventually black's going to be able to castle on the king side. That's going to free up the knight. The knight is attacking this critical square in the center of the board on e5. So this queen, although it's attacking the king, also putting another pressure point on e5, also attacking this pawn here on b7. So a lot of different threats that black has to deal with from that very early setup of queen to e2. That's why I really like putting the queen to e2 there early in the game. So we just looked at all the variations if black plays knight to h5, which is the preferred move. They should go there. It's not a great move, but that's where they should be going. But they could decide to just take here on e5. Not really a strong move from black because they're immediately giving up their central control, especially of this e5 square, critical square in the dragon variation. And if they give that up right away, Well, now they're in a pretty tough spot. If they come to h5, same as before, not a great square for this knight right here. White can get pretty aggressive. Bishop to b5 check, preparing to castle on the king side. Maybe bishop to d7, but then pawn g4. And black is out of squares. Can't come here to g3 because it's defended by the pawn. Can't come here to f4, defended by the bishop right here. Yeah, you could always take this pawn in the center of the board, but then the knight's going to fall here on h5. It's going to start chipping away on the king side of the board. King doesn't have any safety anymore. How does black really continue right here? If you take, yeah, you can just recapture right here. So many different variations that black has to deal with. At the end of the day, they're definitely going to be in a world of hurt. Now, they don't have to play their knight to h5. They could play knight to d7. Says, yeah, I'm just going to attack it from this standpoint. But white can just push forward, put a lot of pressure on them, and depending on how they want to continue, they're going to have a tough position. If they take right here, white's going to recapture, and then they're putting so much pressure. The queen right here on d8's under attack, the bishop here on g7, probably going to take the knight here on c3 because they have to. Gives white double pawns, but that's fine. Queen comes down here to a5, and then queen up here to d5. Still has to worry about this knight here on e6, attacking the rook here on h8. Black's just in a world of hurt. White can still castle on the king side as well. And if they say, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. Instead, maybe they think something like knight to e5. Okay, well, now white can just take here on f7. The king's going to recapture here. And then white can just attack the king the rest of the game. So that's why at the beginning of the game, you're probably going to see if they play the bishop here to g7 and you play e5, they're probably going to play h5. Just know if they don't, though, it is going to be a mistake. If they do, you're still going to have a very good game. The next variation in the Levenfish attack is going to be knight to c6. Now, I do see this a little bit more than a bishop to g7 these days, but there's not as many lines to go over because many of them are forced. In this case, I'm going to take with my knight here on c6, and they're going to recapture with their pawn here on c6. So you can see those are pretty much forced, and then I'm playing e5 right here. So there are some variations as far as where they could go. They could just immediately take right here. In that case, I'm going to be playing queen takes here on d8. Then the queen takes here. My pawn's going to take, a lot of different options as far as where the knight goes. Maybe the knight comes down here to g4, attacking the pawn, bishop here to f4. And this is a setup I'm going to be completely fine with. When I say these specific setups, if you play these openings a lot, and I always recommend, especially players getting into chess or trying to find a specific opening, find openings you like, that you have one fun playing with, but you've had good success, and then play them over and over, and then find positions like this and just study the board and figure out what plan you want to attack and where, if your opponent goes one place, where would you go? And so that's why I like to look at these positions. So this is getting into the opening, transitioning into the middle game, but this is definitely a position I get into quite a bit. From here, you can castle a lot to the queen side of the board, get your rook involved to this d file right away. Your opponent, you can see here, does not have either of his bishops involved into the game. This is an open board state right here, so both sides having the double bishops is going to be a pretty aggressive game, even though the queens are off the board here. If we come back and say maybe the pawn doesn't take, if the pawn doesn't take, the queens are not going to come off the board right away, and that's completely fine as well. Another move they could play is knight to d7. This retreats the knight's under attack, so that does make sense. And it also says, yeah, I can now attack this pawn here on e5. If they do that, I like to play queen to f3. Very aggressive line, attacks this undefended pawn here on c6. And says, yeah, I don't really care if you take right here. I can recapture. I can always take here on c6, pinning down the knight before that. So a lot of different options. Bring my bishop involved into the game. At some point, castle on the king side. I always have the option to castle on the queen side. In this position, I still am probably going to be castling more on the king side. So that's one option. Another option that don't see too often, but every now and then you will see an opponent's played knight to g4. It says, hey, if you want to attack my knight, I'm just going to double attack your pawn here. That's fine, though, because h3, what are they really going to do? They're not going to capture here. Just going to capture with your pawn. They're going to go down material. That's definitely a bad exchange. So they're going to be playing knight to h6. I assure you, this is not a good square for the knight at all. And anytime my opponent plays a weak move like this, I'm going to be pretty aggressive. So queen to f3 as well. Get very aggressive here. You can see attacking this pawn right here. They're probably going to be getting their queen involved into the game, or bishop to b7, but they're still playing pretty defensive here. I can activate my pieces, knight here on h6, again, not doing too much. So that's what happens if they played knight to c6. Very common, but again, pretty straightforward. You're going to be taking, and then it really just depends on how they want to approach the center of the board. The last variation we are going to look at is knight to d7. This does a few things. One, it defends this knight here on f6, which could be attacked at some point. It also adds another defender to the critical square of e5. So if they want to play bishop to g7, push forward with e5, they have another defender here. In this case, as many times as I'm playing a very aggressive line here with the Levenfish Attack, I'm going to be pretty aggressive in this line as well. And so I'm going to be playing queen to f3. I am later going to be looking to get my bishops involved into the game, but I really like playing the queen to f3. Now, they could decide immediately to attack in the center of the board. Pretty common in this case. I'm going to go ahead and take. They're probably going to recapture with their knight. They could take with their pawn, absolutely, and then we have to move our knight out of the way. But they're usually going to take with their knight because this is threatening our queen here on f3 and says, hey, you need to move that. Well, I'm not going to move it right away. Instead, I have an in-between move, bishop to b5 check. They're probably going to have to defend this. Bishop to d7 makes a lot of sense. I'm going to take that right away. I think that's fine. They're probably going to take with their knight here on d7. I say probably because, hey, if they want to come back here to d7, I don't have to worry about my queen right now. I can castle on the king side. That's fine. So I'm going over the optimal moves. Yes, your opponent may be making mistakes, and then you can look at that and say, hey, that's not what they should be doing. Maybe I don't have to play the main lines here, and how can I exploit what they're trying to do? So we're generally going to see knight ticking here on d7. And if this is the case, I would play queen to g3. And I feel like this is a pretty good setup from here. If they wanted to continue, you could see bishop to g7, bishop to f4. Now, in this case, I'm probably going to be looking to castle on the queen side of the board. Very, very few times that I will be looking to castle on the queen side of the board. Other times I'm looking to castle on the king side because it's so easy for black to come down, take my knight here on c3, and then I recapture with my pawn here on c3, and it's not a very good queen side castle. But in this setup specifically, I found that castling on the queen side does pretty good for white. So that's what happens if they push early on with that pawn on e5. Now, they don't have to do that. Instead, another move that they could play is a6. We talked about this before. Pretty common in the Sicilian defense. This does stop both the knight coming here to b5 as well as this one. In this case, I'm going to be playing bishop to e3 in this position. Bishop coming here to g7. I do feel like because the queen here on f3 is no longer defending this knight, it is nice to have another defender here. You can now castle on the queen side if you wanted to as well. But bishop to e3 is a pretty safe setup for white here. The last option is they could just decide play bishop to g7. This is the main theme that you have in the Dragon variation, so it makes a lot of sense just to go ahead and play bishop here to g7. Same thing, bishop here to e3. If they castle on the king side, I'm going to go ahead and castle on the queen side. And then it's pretty much just an all-out attack. I'm going to start pushing g4 here at some point, really start to chip away at their king side of the board. So that is the Levenfish Attack. Again, this is the way that I like to attack the Dragon variation. I know a lot of other players play this as well. So if you haven't tried it out, I definitely recommend it. Very, very good winning percentage from white. Just if you're looking not only at just club level players, but if you're looking at grandmasters for the last 100 years, white does very favorable. So this is just not a, hey, f4 attack. Wow, I don't know if that's actually going to do well. This is a very, very strong attack. But thank you guys so much for watching the video. Hopefully you enjoyed this in-depth analysis of a variation in the Dragon variation. If you guys like the video, if you wouldn't mind liking it, also feel free to leave me a comment in the section below, trying to respond to those more and more. You can always reach me on the website at thechesswebsite.com. You can chat me on there. You can always reach out to me via email as well, thechesswebsite@gmail.com. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.